The call came through to Kensington Palace at 7:43 on a Tuesday evening in October. William was reviewing briefing papers for the following day's engagements when his private secretary entered without knocking, a breach of protocol that immediately signaled crisis. The archivist at Balmoral Castle needed to speak with him directly, immediately, about something that couldn't be discussed over regular palace lines. Within minutes, William was connected through secure channels to Margaret Thornhill, the royal archivist who'd spent 3 decades managing the family's historical collections. Her voice carried an unsteadiness William had never heard before, and Margaret was not someone who unsettled easily. She'd catalogued everything from medieval manuscripts to Queen Victoria's journals, had seen correspondence detailing royal scandals across centuries, had preserved documents most people would never know existed. But what she'd found that afternoon had shaken her badly enough to break protocol and demand immediate contact with the Prince of Wales. The discovery had happened almost accidentally. Margaret had been working through a collection of boxes from a storage room that hadn't been properly inventoried since the 1950s. Most contained exactly what the cursory label suggested: household accounts, staff records, mundane administrative papers from George VI's reign. But one box, marked simply Private 1940 to 1942, and stored at the back of a locked cabinet, contained something different. Inside were letters, dozens of them written in a hand Margaret recognized immediately as belonging to the Duke of Windsor, the former Edward VIII, who'd abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson. But these weren't the sanitized correspondence that existed in official archives. These were private letters that had apparently been hidden deliberately, removed from the main collection, and secured separately for reasons that became clear as Margaret began reading. The letters detailed conversations Edward had engaged in during the early years of World War II while he was living in exile, conversations with individuals whose names made Margaret's blood run cold. German officials, Nazi sympathizers, people who'd been working to negotiate a separate peace that would have left Hitler in control of continental Europe while preserving British neutrality, with Edward potentially restored to the throne under German patronage. The correspondence wasn't treasonous in the technical sense. Edward was no longer king and owed no legal allegiance. But it revealed a level of collaboration and negotiation that went far beyond the uncomfortable Nazi sympathies historians had long suspected. Edward hadn't merely been photographed with German officials or made questionable statements. He'd been actively involved in discussions about Britain's potential surrender, about arrangements for his return to power, about the structure of a post-war Europe under Nazi control. And according to the letters, he hadn't been acting entirely alone. Several names appeared repeatedly: aristocrats, politicians, even members of the extended royal family who'd shared Edward's defeatist views and had participated in these conversations. Some of those names belonged to people whose descendants were still prominent in British public life. Margaret had stopped reading after the first dozen letters, realizing she'd stumbled into something that transcended normal archival protocol. This wasn't historical curiosity. It was potential dynamite that could destroy reputations, rewrite history books, and fundamentally damage the monarchy's standing if made public. She'd locked everything back in the cabinet, left the storage room, and immediately contacted William's office. As heir to the throne, he needed to know, and he needed to decide what to do with information that had apparently been deliberately hidden for over 80 years. William listened to Margaret's explanation with growing unease. He asked if she'd told anyone else. She confirmed she'd shown the letters to no one, had mentioned their existence to no one, had secured them immediately, and contacted only William. He instructed her to maintain absolute silence and to move the entire box to the castle's most secure vault. He would travel to Balmoral immediately to examine the documents personally before any decisions were made about their disposition. After the call ended, William sat in silence for several minutes, processing what he'd just learned. The Duke of Windsor's Nazi sympathies had been documented for decades. Historians had written extensively about his questionable political views, his meeting with Hitler in 1937, his problematic statements during the war. But this sounded different. This wasn't just sympathetic views or poor judgment. This was active collaboration with people working against Britain's interests during its most desperate hour. If the letters contained what Margaret suggested, they would fundamentally alter historical understanding of the abdication crisis and the war years. They would reveal that the monarchy had harbored traitors, or at least those willing to contemplate treason. They would destroy the carefully maintained narrative that the royal family had stood unified against Nazism, that Edward's abdication had been purely about marriage rather than politics. And depending on who else was named in the correspondence, the revelations could damage or destroy living people whose only crime was being related to historical figures who'd made catastrophic choices 80 years ago. William knew he couldn't make this decision alone. He needed to see the documents himself, needed to understand their full scope and implications, and he needed to do it quickly, quietly, before anyone else stumbled onto this discovery. The window for controlling this information was narrow and closing rapidly. Catherine was at Windsor with the children for their half-term break. William called her immediately, explaining only that something urgent had come up that required him to fly to Scotland tonight. He couldn't provide details over the phone but would explain everything once he returned. Catherine knew better than to press. When William used that particular tone, it meant genuine crisis rather than ordinary palace emergency. William's security team was informed he needed immediate transport to Balmoral. No explanation was provided beyond urgent family matter requiring personal attention. They were accustomed to sudden changes in royal schedules and began arranging for the helicopter that would ferry him from Kensington to RAF Northolt, where a plane waited to take him to Aberdeen. His private secretary assembled a minimal team, just 2 aides who held the highest security clearances and were accustomed to handling sensitive material. They would accompany William to Scotland, examine the documents with him, and help assess the situation. No one else needed to know. Not yet. Possibly not ever, depending on what those letters contained. As William prepared to leave, he thought about his great-great-uncle Edward. The official history was familiar. Edward had fallen in love with an American divorcee, had chosen personal happiness over duty, had abdicated, and lived the rest of his life in comfortable exile. He'd been painted sometimes sympathetically as a romantic figure, sometimes critically as someone who'd shirked responsibility, but always as someone whose greatest flaw had been prioritizing love over throne. What if that entire narrative was a cover story? What if Edward had been removed not primarily because of Wallace Simpson, but because his political views and Nazi connections had made him a liability Britain couldn't afford during wartime? What if the abdication had been less about love and more about preventing someone with fascist sympathies from remaining king while Hitler threatened invasion? Those questions had been debated by historians for decades, usually dismissed as conspiracy theory. Now, William was about to discover whether there was documentary evidence supporting the darkest interpretation of events. The helicopter lifted off from Kensington just after 9 o'clock, carrying William toward whatever devastating truth waited in a locked cabinet at Balmoral. The flight to Northolt took 20 minutes. The plane to Aberdeen took 90 minutes. And during the entire journey, William sat in silence, contemplating what he might find and what he would do with it once found. Some discoveries couldn't be undiscovered. Some truths, once known, changed everything. And William understood that in a few hours he would know something about his family's history that might burden him for the rest of his life, a secret so toxic it had been hidden for 8 decades, now suddenly exposed by an archivist's routine inventory work. The plane began its descent into Aberdeen just before midnight. A car waited to drive him the 50 miles to Balmoral through the dark Scottish countryside. And at the castle, in a locked vault, a box of letters waited to reveal whether the monarchy William would someday inherit was built on a foundation more compromised than anyone had dared admit. The drive from Aberdeen to Balmoral in darkness felt longer than its actual 90-minute duration. William sat in the back of the Range Rover, watching the Scottish Highlands pass in shadow, his mind cycling through scenarios of what he might find. His 2 aides maintained respectful silence. They knew only that an urgent archival matter required the Prince of Wales's immediate attention. The specifics would be revealed once they reached the castle. Balmoral at midnight was both familiar and unsettling. William had spent countless holidays here, knew every room and corridor, associated the estate with family gatherings and summer relaxation. But approaching it now on a secret midnight mission to examine potentially explosive historical documents transformed the castle into something different, a repository of secrets, a place where uncomfortable truths had been locked away for generations. Margaret Thornhill was waiting in the main entrance, looking exhausted and anxious. She'd spent the past 5 hours since their call reviewing the documents more thoroughly, and what she'd found had only deepened her concern. She led William and his aides to the castle's secure archive room, a climate-controlled space in the basement where the most sensitive materials were stored. The box sat on an examination table, innocuous in appearance, standard archival storage, maybe 18 inches long, 12 inches wide, 8 inches deep. Nothing about its exterior suggested the historical bombshell it apparently contained. Margaret had left it exactly as she'd found it, removing nothing except to relocate it from the unlocked storage room to this secure space. William approached the table slowly, aware that once he looked inside, he couldn't unknow what he learned. Margaret offered context before he opened it. The box had been mislabeled or deliberately disguised. The exterior marking said, Private 1940 to 1942, but offered no indication of authorship or content. It had been stored behind other boxes, accessible only by moving several other containers. She'd found it only because she was doing the first comprehensive reorganization of that storage area in 70 years. The letters inside were organized chronologically, dating from June 1940 through November 1942. Most were from Edward to various correspondents, with some copies of replies included. They'd apparently been preserved by someone who recognized their historical significance but also their potential danger. Rather than destroying them, which might have been the sensible choice, someone had hidden them, perhaps believing they might someday need to be revealed, or perhaps unable to destroy correspondence from a former king, regardless of its content. William put on the cotton gloves archivists used when handling fragile documents and carefully removed the first letter from the box. It was dated June 20, 1940, just days after France's surrender to Germany. Edward was writing from Lisbon, where he and Wallace had fled from France ahead of the German advance. The recipient was a German diplomat Edward had known before the war. The letter's tone was casual, almost friendly, despite Britain and Germany being at war. Edward expressed his belief that continued fighting was pointless, that Britain couldn't possibly win against German military superiority, that sensible people on both sides should be working toward negotiated peace. He suggested that the current British government, Churchill's government, was too inflexible, too wedded to outdated notions of honor and resistance. Different leadership might reach different conclusions about Britain's best interests. The implications were clear even in that first letter. Edward was suggesting to a German official that Churchill's government should be replaced with one more amenable to negotiating surrender, and he was positioning himself, implicitly, as someone who might provide such alternative leadership if circumstances changed. William read 3 more letters in quick succession, each more disturbing than the last. In July 1940, Edward wrote about conversations he'd had with intermediaries about potential terms for peace. By August, he was discussing specific arrangements: what would happen to the British Empire, how governance would be structured, whether he might return to Britain in some capacity if peace were negotiated. None of it constituted treason in the legal sense. Edward was no longer king, technically held no position requiring loyalty to the British government. But morally, politically, historically, it was devastating. Here was a former king actively working with enemy representatives while Britain fought desperately for survival. While the RAF battled in the skies during the Battle of Britain, while civilians endured the Blitz, Edward was in Lisbon discussing terms for surrender. William's aides read over his shoulder, their expressions growing grimmer with each document. This wasn't historical nuance or complex interpretation. It was documentary evidence of collaboration. The letters were clear, specific, detailed. They revealed Edward as not merely sympathetic to Nazi Germany, but actively engaged in efforts to undermine British resistance. But the letter's most devastating aspect wasn't Edward's behavior. Historians had long suspected he'd been problematic during the war years. What made these documents truly explosive were the other names appearing in the correspondence. Edward wasn't acting alone. He was corresponding with British aristocrats who shared his views, with politicians who thought accommodation with Hitler was preferable to continued fighting, with family members who supported his position. One letter from October 1940 mentioned conversations Edward had with his brother George, Duke of Kent, the king's brother, Edward's younger sibling. George was described as sympathetic to Edward's position, believing that Britain might need to seek terms if America didn't enter the war soon. The letter suggested George had spoken with others in the family about potentially pressuring their brother, King George VI, to reconsider his support for Churchill's government. The Duke of Kent had died in a plane crash in 1942, lionized as a war hero. His reputation had remained sterling for 8 decades. This letter suggested his wartime heroism might have been more complicated, that he'd at least considered supporting his elder brother's defeatist position. Other names appeared, aristocrats whose descendants were still prominent in British society, whose families maintained positions in the House of Lords, who were connected through marriage to the current royal family. Publication of these letters wouldn't just damage historical reputations. It would create contemporary scandals, would force living people to answer for their ancestors' choices, would generate uncomfortable questions about whether these attitudes had persisted through generations. William read for over 2 hours, working through the entire collection chronologically. Margaret had done a preliminary count. 57 letters total, spanning 2.5 years. The correspondence ended abruptly in November 1942, with no explanation for why. Either Edward had stopped saving copies, or someone had collected these specific letters and hidden them while destroying or removing others. The final letter in the collection was perhaps the most chilling. Dated November 15, 1942, it was from Edward to an intermediary who'd been facilitating his communications with German officials. Edward expressed frustration that his efforts had come to nothing, that the war was continuing without any progress toward the negotiated peace he'd been advocating. But he closed with a statement that sent cold through William's spine. Perhaps when this is over, history will recognize who truly served Britain's interests and who sacrificed the nation to Churchill's vanity. Edward apparently believed or wanted to believe that he'd been trying to save Britain from disaster while Churchill led the nation to destruction. The historical irony was almost unbearable. Churchill had saved Britain. Edward's negotiated peace would have meant subjugation to Nazi Germany. Yet Edward, even in 1942, when the tide was beginning to turn, remained convinced he'd been right and Churchill wrong. William closed the final letter and sat back, processing what he'd read. His aides were equally silent, understanding they'd just been exposed to historical information that could rewrite World War II narratives and damage the monarchy's carefully maintained image. Margaret asked the question everyone was thinking: what should be done with these documents? They'd been hidden for over 80 years for obvious reasons. Should they remain hidden? Should they be destroyed to protect reputations and institutions? Should they be preserved but kept classified? Should they be made public so historians could incorporate them into the historical record? William had no immediate answer. The archivist in him believed historical documents should be preserved and eventually made accessible to researchers. The royal in him recognized that publication would create enormous controversy and potential damage. The moral person in him understood that truth mattered, even when inconvenient or painful. But he needed time to think, to consult, to consider implications beyond the immediate shock of discovery. He instructed Margaret to keep the documents in the secure vault, with access restricted to just her and him. No one else was to know these letters existed. Not yet. He would take photographs of key documents back to London for closer analysis and consultation with trusted advisors, but the originals would remain at Balmoral, locked away as they had been for 8 decades. As dawn broke over the Scottish Highlands, William prepared for the return journey to London. He'd flown to Scotland in crisis mode, unsure what he'd find. He was leaving with devastating knowledge. Documentary proof that his great-great-uncle had collaborated with Nazi Germany, that other family members had at least considered supporting that collaboration, that the abdication crisis and war years were more morally compromised than official histories admitted. The weight of this knowledge would travel back with him to London, where he would have to decide whether some truths were too destructive to be revealed or whether historical honesty demanded exposure regardless of consequences. William returned to Kensington Palace just after noon on Wednesday, having barely slept during the flight back from Aberdeen. Catherine was waiting in their private sitting room, having sent the children to their lessons. She'd spent the night worrying William's sudden departure, and cryptic explanation had suggested genuine crisis rather than routine emergency. He showed her selected photographs of the letters on his secured tablet, watching her expression shift from curiosity to shock to something approaching horror as she read Edward's casual discussions of British surrender. Catherine had studied history at St. Andrews, knew the standard narratives of the abdication and war years. Seeing documentary evidence that contradicted those narratives was fundamentally unsettling. Her first question was practical. Who else knew? William confirmed that only Margaret the archivist, his 2 aides, and now Catherine had seen the documents or knew of their existence. The circle was deliberately small. Every additional person brought in increased the risk of exposure, intentional or otherwise. Catherine's strategic mind immediately grasped the implications. If these letters became public, the monarchy would face sustained criticism about wartime loyalties, about whether the institution had genuinely opposed Nazism or had harbored defeatists and collaborators. Edward's sympathies would be condemned, but more damaging would be the revelation that he wasn't alone, that other royals and aristocrats had shared his views. The Duke of Kent's apparent involvement was particularly problematic. He'd been commemorated as a war hero, had buildings and foundations named after him, remained fondly remembered by his descendants. Revealing that he'd at least entertained defeatist views would tarnish his legacy and hurt his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who carried his name with pride. But suppressing the documents also carried risks. If they were rediscovered by others, or if William's knowledge of them was later revealed, accusations of cover-up would be devastating. The monarchy would be seen as protecting treasonous ancestors, hiding historical truth to preserve reputations. The damage from that might exceed the damage from honest disclosure. William had been wrestling with this calculation throughout the return flight. Both options, disclosure or suppression, carried enormous risks. There appeared to be no safe path, only choices between different types of damage. He decided to consult the one person whose judgment he trusted absolutely on matters of institutional preservation: his father, King Charles. Whatever their personal relationship complexities, Charles had spent decades thinking about the monarchy's survival and evolution. He understood how to balance historical honesty with institutional protection. The meeting was arranged for that evening at Clarence House. William brought the tablet with photographed letters, having told Charles only that an urgent historical matter required immediate private discussion. Charles cleared his schedule and ensured complete privacy: no staff, no advisors, just father and son confronting a family crisis that spanned generations. Charles read through the selected letters with characteristic thoughtfulness, occasionally pausing to reread passages or making quiet observations. His face revealed no shock at 76, having lived through decades of royal scandals and crises. Little surprised him, but William could see the calculation happening, the weighing of implications and options. When Charles finished reading, his first observation was characteristically nuanced. The letters were unquestionably damaging, but context mattered. Edward had written them in 1940 to 1942, when Britain's situation appeared desperate to many intelligent observers. Belief that negotiated peace was preferable to national destruction wasn't inherently treasonous. It was defeatist, perhaps certainly, but motivated by perceived pragmatism rather than malice. William countered that motivation didn't change the fundamental fact: Edward had been working with enemy representatives to undermine his own nation's war effort. The Duke of Kent and others named in the letters had at least entertained such collaboration. These weren't merely pessimistic assessments. They were active efforts to facilitate British surrender. Charles acknowledged this, but raised the historical precedent of similar documents. Churchill's government had known about Edward's problematic communications. That's why he'd been shipped off to the Bahamas as governor, getting him as far from Europe as possible. The government had apparently considered charging him with treason, but had decided the damage from prosecuting a former king exceeded the benefit of punishment. The fact that these specific letters had been hidden suggested Churchill or someone in his circle had decided documentary proof needed to be secured but not destroyed or made public. They'd been preserved as potential leverage if Edward ever caused problems, but also kept secret to avoid the scandal their revelation would create. That decision had worked for 80 years. The question now was whether 21st-century circumstances required a different calculation. Charles suggested consulting the cabinet secretary, the government's most senior civil servant, someone accustomed to handling classified material and constitutional crises. But William resisted. Every person brought into the circle increased exposure risk. Once government officials knew, the information would eventually leak, or be subject to freedom of information requests, or be mentioned in someone's memoirs. They debated through the evening, cycling through options without reaching consensus. Destroy the documents entirely? That would eliminate the problem, but felt like falsifying history. Keep them hidden indefinitely? That was essentially continuing the status quo, but now with more people aware of the secret. Make them public? That would be historically honest but institutionally destructive. Charles finally offered a compromise. Consult one trusted historian who could evaluate the document's authenticity and historical significance without being told where they came from or that the royal family was involved. Present them as recently discovered letters whose provenance was unclear. Get expert opinion on their likely impact if made public, Then decide based on informed assessment rather than fearful speculation. William saw merit in this approach but worried about maintaining secrecy. Any historian would immediately recognize Edward's handwriting, would deduce that the letters came from royal archives. The risk of word spreading seemed substantial. Catherine, who'd been listening to the debate, suggested a modification. Rather than consulting a historian, what if they showed the letters to the Imperial War Museum's director? The museum regularly handled sensitive wartime documents and had procedures for evaluating whether materials should be made public or kept classified for national security reasons. The director could assess the letters under those protocols without the royal family having to make the decision unilaterally. Charles appreciated the logic but noted that involving any institution created a permanent record. If the War Museum's director evaluated these documents, that evaluation would be logged, filed, potentially subject to disclosure. The circle would expand beyond the handful of people currently aware. The meeting ended without resolution. William took the tablet back to Kensington, promising to consider all options carefully before making any decision. Charles emphasized that whatever choice was made needed to be defensible both historically and institutionally. They couldn't simply prioritize protecting the family's reputation that would be morally indefensible. But they also couldn't ignore the genuine damage that revealing these letters would cause to living people whose only fault was being related to historical figures who'd made terrible choices. That night, William lay awake thinking about his great-great-uncle Edward. History had been relatively kind to him, the romantic who gave up a throne for love, who lived in comfortable exile, who'd been more foolish than malicious. That narrative was probably too generous, but it was familiar and mostly harmless. The letters would destroy that narrative permanently. Edward would be remembered as a Nazi collaborator, as someone who'd worked actively against Britain during its darkest hour, as someone whose abdication had perhaps been necessary not just personally but politically, because his views were fundamentally incompatible with Britain's survival. And the Duke of Kent, William's great-great-uncle, who died in service, would be tainted by association. The aristocrats whose names appeared in the correspondence would be exposed. Families would be damaged. Reputations built over generations would crumble. All because an archivist had been doing her job, inventorying a storage room that hadn't been properly examined in 70 years, finding a box that someone had hidden deliberately but hadn't destroyed. Sometimes, William reflected, the past was supposed to stay in the past. But historical truth had a way of emerging regardless of how carefully it was buried. And now he held that truth in his hands, photographed on a secured tablet, locked in a vault at Balmoral, demanding a decision that would define his relationship with history, honesty, and the institution he would someday lead. The decision William had hoped to make privately became complicated by external pressure when, 3 days after his return from Balmoral, a reporter from The Guardian called Kensington Palace's press office with a peculiar inquiry. Had the Prince of Wales recently traveled to Scotland on urgent business? Had this trip involved accessing royal archives? Was there any connection between this visit and rumors of previously unknown documents related to World War II? The questions were vague enough to suggest the reporter had fragments of information rather than a complete story, but someone had talked, or noticed, or made connections. William's supposedly secret midnight flight to Balmoral hadn't been as invisible as he'd hoped. His communications director fielded the call with standard deflections. The Prince of Wales's private schedule wasn't commented upon. No information about royal archives could be confirmed or denied. The palace would respond to any formal inquiries through proper channels. But internally, alarm bells were ringing. William called Margaret at Balmoral immediately. Had she mentioned the discovery to anyone? She insisted she hadn't. The only people aware were William, his 2 aides, and whoever William had subsequently told. She'd followed his instructions, precisely keeping the documents secured and discussing them with no one. But palace security and staff had noted William's sudden arrival and departure. Flight logs existed. Helicopter manifests had been filed. Various people had observed pieces of the puzzle, even if none saw the complete picture. Someone had apparently assembled enough fragments to make educated guesses and had fed those guesses to a reporter. The Guardian reporter wasn't the only one asking questions. Over the next 48 hours, 3 other journalists from different outlets made similar inquiries, each with slightly different angles, but all circling around the same basic story. William had flown secretly to Scotland to deal with something in the archives, something significant enough to require immediate personal attention. The story was becoming self-fulfilling. Even without anyone leaking directly, the very fact of inquiries generated more inquiries. Journalists were now investigating why William had gone to Balmoral, and that investigation itself was drawing attention to whatever he'd been trying to keep quiet. William convened an emergency meeting with his senior advisors at Kensington Palace. Present were his private secretary, communications director, the two aides who'd accompanied him to Scotland, and Catherine. Notably absent was King Charles. William wanted to handle this himself without pulling his father deeper into the crisis. The consensus was grim. The story was going to break eventually. Too many people had noticed fragments. The Guardian was clearly preparing something, probably for weekend publication. Other outlets would follow once the first story ran. The palace could deny and deflect for a few more days at most, but the time for keeping this completely secret had passed. The question was no longer whether the story would become public, but what version of the story the palace wanted told. They could stay silent and let journalists piece together narratives from fragmented information, likely resulting in speculation and inaccuracy. Or they could get ahead of it by making controlled disclosure before the press forced chaotic revelation. William's communications director outlined options for controlled disclosure. Release a statement confirming that historical documents had been discovered during routine archival work at Balmoral. Acknowledge that Prince William had reviewed these documents personally due to their sensitive nature. Decline to specify what the documents contained, citing ongoing historical evaluation. This would confirm the basic facts journalists already suspected while maintaining some control over narrative. Alternatively, they could be more transparent. Release the letters' existence and general content while explaining the decision-making process about whether to make them fully public. Frame it as responsible historical stewardship rather than attempted cover-up. Allow historians and the public to debate what should be done rather than making the decision unilaterally. William struggled with both options. The first felt like confirmation that the palace had something to hide. Why refuse to specify content unless it was damaging? The second felt like voluntarily creating the scandal he'd been trying to prevent. Catherine offered a third option that no one had yet voiced. What if they simply released the letters entirely, all at once, with full transparency? Acknowledge their existence and content, express appropriate regret about what they revealed, but demonstrate complete openness rather than appearing to hide or minimize uncomfortable truths. The suggestion shocked the room. William's private secretary immediately outlined the risks: uncontrolled damage to the monarchy's reputation, ammunition for Republican movements, devastating impact on living descendants of people named in the letters, complete loss of control over how the story would be framed. But Catherine's logic was compelling. Every attempt to control or suppress historically significant information eventually failed and made the eventual revelation worse. The letters would become public eventually through leaks, through FOI requests, through investigative journalism. Better to release them voluntarily on the palace's terms than have them exposed through hostile reporting. William saw merit in her argument but worried about the immediate impact. The letters revealed his great-great-uncle as a Nazi collaborator, implicated the Duke of Kent and others, suggested the royal family had been more divided about opposing Hitler than history acknowledged. Releasing this information would dominate news cycles for weeks, would require explanation and apology, would force the monarchy to confront ugly aspects of its history. But the alternative, continued attempts to keep the letters secret or to release carefully edited portions, felt increasingly untenable. The Guardian was clearly preparing to break the story regardless. Other journalists were pursuing it independently. The information was already escaping, and attempts to contain it would likely fail while making the palace appear guilty of cover-up. The debate continued through the afternoon and into evening. William's advisors were split between cautious, limited disclosure and Catherine's more radical transparency. No one was comfortable with any option, which perhaps indicated that all options were genuinely difficult rather than one being clearly superior. William called his father again that evening, updating him on the press inquiries and the discussions about response. Charles's reaction was measured. He noted that the monarchy had survived worse than embarrassing historical revelations: Wallis Simpson, Diana's death, Andrew scandals. Each had seemed potentially fatal at the time. Each had been survived through some combination of transparency, adaptation, and time. What Charles feared more than the letter's content was perception that the family was trying to hide historical truth. The monarchy's survival depended on public belief that it was fundamentally honest, that it acknowledged rather than denied its failings. If William tried to suppress these letters and was caught doing so, the damage would be catastrophic. Charles's advice ultimately was to err on the side of transparency. Release the letters with appropriate context, express appropriate regret, and trust that the British public was sophisticated enough to separate historical failings from contemporary institutions. Edward had been dead for over 50 years. The Duke of Kent had died in 1942. The people named in these letters were gone, their political views discredited by history. Revealing what they'd said 80 years ago was embarrassing, but not existentially threatening. William absorbed his father's counsel but remained uncertain. The decision felt enormous whether to expose family secrets that had been deliberately hidden for 8 decades, knowing that exposure would cause pain to living relatives and damage carefully maintained historical narratives. But external events were making the decision for him. By Friday evening, The Guardian informed the palace they were publishing a story on Sunday about William's secret flight to Balmoral and archival discoveries related to World War II. They offered the palace an opportunity to comment before publication. The story was breaking whether William wanted it to or not. The question was no longer if these letters would become public, but how. And William realized, with a sense of inevitability, that he needed to choose transparency rather than have transparency forced upon him by journalistic investigation. He authorized his communications director to prepare a full statement for Saturday morning, beating The Guardian's Sunday publication. The statement would acknowledge the letters' discovery, outline their content honestly, and announce that they would be made available to historians and eventually the public after proper conservation and authentication. The decision was made. The devastating discovery he'd flown to Scotland to investigate would now become public knowledge. And the monarchy would have to confront the uncomfortable truth that even during its finest hour World War II it had harbored voices advocating surrender and collaboration. The statement released from Kensington Palace at 8 o'clock Saturday morning was unprecedented in its candor. Rather than the usual careful palace language that obscured as much as it revealed, this statement was direct and detailed. It confirmed that during routine archival work at Balmoral, previously unknown correspondence from Edward, Duke of Windsor, had been discovered. The letters revealed that the former king had engaged in communications with German officials and intermediaries about potential negotiated peace while Britain was fighting for survival. The letters showed Edward held defeatist views, believed British resistance was futile, and apparently worked to facilitate discussions about surrender terms. The statement acknowledged that other names appeared in the correspondence, including members of the royal family and aristocracy. It expressed profound regret that these individuals had contemplated positions that history had proven catastrophically wrong. It noted that Churchill's government had apparently been aware of Edward's problematic communications, which explained why he'd been sent to the Bahamas, effectively exiled to prevent him causing further damage. Most significantly, the statement announced that the complete letters would be digitized and made available to accredited historians immediately, with public access to follow after proper conservation. The palace was not attempting to suppress or selectively release this information. It was being transparent about uncomfortable historical truths. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. News organizations globally led with the story. Royal archives reveal Edward VIII Nazi collaboration, ran the Times headline. Duke of Windsor worked for British defeat, declared The Guardian. International media picked it up within hours, translating the story into dozens of languages. But the response wasn't uniformly negative toward the current royal family. Many commentators praised William for releasing the information rather than hiding it. Historians lauded the transparency, noting this was precisely how archives should operate, preserving historical truth even when inconvenient or embarrassing. The more critical responses focused on Edward himself and those named in the letters. The Duke of Windsor's reputation, already complicated, was now permanently tarnished. The romantic narrative of the king who gave up everything for love was replaced by the darker truth. He'd been a Nazi sympathizer who'd worked against his own nation during wartime. Historians began analyzing the letters within hours of their digital release. The scholarly consensus quickly formed. The letters confirmed what many had suspected but couldn't prove, that Edward had been more than merely sympathetic to Nazi Germany, that he'd actively worked to undermine British resistance. The revelation about the Duke of Kent was more surprising but not entirely shocking, given what was already known about aristocratic defeatism in 1940. Several academic institutions announced plans for conferences examining the letter's historical significance. Publishers contacted historians about book projects.